The city did not slow for cold. It never did. New York ground forward the same in February as it did in July, horns and exhaust, and the particular rhythm of 10 million people who had somewhere else to be. The snow had started that morning and had not stopped, and by 3 in the afternoon the sidewalks along West 57th were packed with a gray-white slush that soaked through cheap boots in under a minute. Daniel Holt knew this because his boots had not been waterproof in 2 winters. He stood at the corner of 57th and 6th, his daughter pressed against his left side, her small face buried in the gap between his coat and his arm. He had one hand on her back. The other held a folder of papers that was growing soft at the corners from the snow. "Daddy," Lily said. Her voice was muffled against his coat. "My toes are wet. I know, bug. Like really wet. Like fish tank wet. 5 more minutes." She tilted her head up to look at him. She had his eyes, that particular shade of gray that looked blue in the morning and almost green near windows, and the expression she wore was the one he thought of as her old soul face. 7 years old, and already she assessed the world with a kind of patient skepticism that reminded him, sometimes painfully, of her mother. "You said 5 more minutes outside the clinic too," she said. He had. He had stood outside the pediatric clinic on Amsterdam Avenue for 11 minutes before admitting the copay this month was not something he could manage without moving money he did not have. He had told Lily it was the wrong day, that he had the appointment mixed up. And she had looked at him with that same face and said nothing. She was 7. She understood more than he let himself believe. "Different 5 minutes," he said. She tucked back into his coat. The building in front of them was 43 stories of glass and pale stone, the kind of structure that existed to make people feel small. A brass plate near the entrance read Hargrove Tower. In letters that had been buffed that morning he could see the circular strokes in the metal, faint and perfect. A doorman in a charcoal coat stood just inside the revolving door, watching the street with the practiced indifference of a man who had been paid to seem imperious. Daniel was not supposed to be here. He was supposed to be at the warehouse on 11th Avenue, loading freight for the overnight run to Newark, a job he had been doing for 7 months and which paid $11 more per hour than the previous job, and still came up short at the end of every month, in ways he had not yet learned to stop feeling ashamed about. But the overnight run had been canceled equipment issue, his supervisor said. Nobody's fault, and Daniel had found himself standing in front of the building where, 4 years ago, he had kept an office on the 28th floor. He had not meant to come. He had just walked, and the city had brought him here. "Are we going in?" Lily asked. "Then why are we standing here?" He looked at her. She blinked at him, waiting. She had a smear of hot chocolate on her chin from the cart on 53rd Street. The one he had spent $4 on because she had been cold, and because $4 was something he could still do. "I used to work here," he said. Lily looked up at the building. She considered it for a moment, with the seriousness she applied to everything that interested her. What happened? Things changed. What kind of things? He thought about how to answer that. He thought about Claire. About the 18 months after the diagnosis, about the morning, 2 years after that, when he had stood in the shell of his company and looked at the board he had built and understood that none of it mattered anymore, not the way the people in that room believed it did. He thought about the day he signed the papers, the day he walked out. "Grown-up things," he said finally. Lily accepted this with a nod that communicated she found it insufficient but was willing to table the matter. He should have turned around then. He should have taken her to the subway, gone back to the apartment on 181st, made dinner from what was in the refrigerator. He had checked that morning. Half a block of cheddar, 3 eggs, most of a loaf of bread. He could do something with that. He thought about the folder in his coat pocket, the one with the documents he had been carrying for 3 days. Telling himself he was going to send them and then not sending them, for reasons he would have called practical if he were being dishonest with himself. He had been waiting for the right moment, which was what people said when they meant they were afraid the moment would turn out to be wrong. He had been wrong before. He had been catastrophically, world-altering wrong, in a way that the people who moved in these buildings generally never were, because catastrophic wrongness required first building something that could fail at that scale. He did not think about that often. It was not productive. Instead, a gust of wind came off the avenue and hit them sideways. And Lily made a small involuntary sound and pressed herself harder against him. and Daniel looked up at the building and thought, just warm up, just get her inside for 5 minutes. The lobby was public, the lobby had heat. He put his hand on her shoulder and steered her toward the revolving door. The doorman saw them coming. On the 31st floor, a meeting was running 14 minutes over. This was not acceptable. Victoria Sloan had a rule about meetings, which was that they ended when they were supposed to end, because time was the only resource that could not be recouped, and people who did not understand this had not yet been poor enough to understand anything. She had been raised in a house where that lesson came early. She did not forget it. She was standing at the window. She always stood at windows during the late portion of meetings, because standing communicated that she was still present, but that the conversation needed to conclude looking down at 57th Street while Marcus Webb, her head of acquisitions, explained for the third time why the Caldwell deal required another 30 days. She was not listening to Marcus. She had understood his argument in the first 12 seconds. The remaining explanation was for his own comfort, and she was willing to allow it to a point. Below, in the snow, she noticed a man and a small child. He was standing at the corner in the kind of coat that had been good once structured, charcoal wool but which had since lost its shape at the shoulders. He was holding the child against him with one hand. In the other, he had a folder of papers, and even from 31 floors up, even through the glaze of the heated glass, she could see that he was standing very still, in the way that people stood still when they were trying to decide something. Victoria Sloan had built a company from $11 million and a set of ideas she had developed, tested, and refined before she was 30. She was now 38. Hale Integrated had revenues north of $400 million and offices in 7 cities, and she had gotten there by reading people, which was to say by understanding what they wanted before they knew how to ask for it, and what they feared before they thought to hide it. She watched the man below look up at the building. There was something in the way he did it. Not longing, she knew longing, and this was not that. It was more like someone looking at a place they had once known and were taking stock of the distance between then and now. Victoria, Marcus said. 30 days is fine, she said, without turning from the window. But I want the updated liability assessment by Thursday, not Friday. If it comes Friday, I'll assume the numbers require the extra day to look acceptable, and we'll revisit the entire structure. Silence from the table. Thursday, Marcus said. Good. She turned. We're done. The lobby was warm. Victoria came off the elevator at 2 minutes past 4, late for nothing, in no hurry, her phone in her coat pocket, and her mind on the Caldwell numbers. She wanted to walk the 3 blocks to the garage rather than take a car. Cold air cleared her, thinking in a way that heated offices did not, and she was halfway across the marble floor when the doorman, whose name was Ernest and who had worked the lobby since before she leased the 31st floor, stepped toward a man and a small girl near the sitting area by the east wall. Sir, Ernest said, if you're not here for a specific appointment, we came in to warm up, the man said. He was calm, not defensive. He said it like it was a reasonable thing, because it was. 5 minutes. My daughter's feet are wet. The lobby is for tenants and their guests. I know the building, the man said. I know the lobby is technically a public easement under the 1974 New York zoning agreement for properties that receive tax abatement during the Hudson Yards corridor extension. I'm not blocking an exit or a desk. We'll be gone in 5 minutes. Ernest blinked. The child was looking at Ernest with the expression of someone who had decided to be very polite, but was prepared to be disappointed. Victoria had stopped walking. She did not know why she had stopped. She had no stake in this. The lobby situation was Ernest's to manage. And Ernest was good at his job. She should have continued to the door. Instead, she said, from across the lobby, Ernest. It's fine. Both men looked at her. The man in the charcoal coat looked at her for a moment, just a moment. And she had the brief, odd sensation of being assessed, and found neither threatening nor particularly remarkable, which was not a sensation she experienced often. Thank you, he said, not fawning, not deferential, just, thank you. She nodded and kept walking. She got 4 steps further before, for reasons she did not entirely understand, she stopped again. What's your name? She asked. She had turned around. She was not sure when she had decided to turn around. The man was seated on the edge of one of the lobby's low benches, his daughter beside him. and he had taken off her small boot and was rubbing her foot between his hands to warm it. He looked up at her without alarm. "Daniel Holt, Victoria Sloan." She said it the way she always said it, evenly, waiting to see if recognition landed on the other person's face. It usually did. He was a reading she couldn't quite place. "I know who you are," he said, and went back to rubbing his daughter's foot. Lily looked up at Victoria with the frank assessment that 7-year-olds apparently felt entitled to. "Your coat is really nice," she said. "Thank you. Is it cashmere?" Victoria looked down at her coat, then at the child. "It is, actually. Daddy says cashmere is a reasonable investment because it lasts," Lily said. "But he also says we're not in a cashmere season." "Lily," Daniel said, without looking up, "I'm just making conversation." There was a group of men from the 14th floor coming off the elevator. Victoria knew them by face, mid-level finance types who worked for one of the funds, and they were watching this tableau with the particular expression of people who expected to be entertained. One of them said something she didn't catch, low, and another laughed. She looked at them. They moved on. "You knew the zoning code," she said, to Daniel. "I spent 3 years dealing with zoning attorneys. You absorb it." "For what kind of work?" He finished with the boot, helped Lily pull it back on, then sat up. He looked at her with that same level quality, not guarded, exactly, but contained, like someone who had learned to keep their own counsel. "Building systems," he said. "Management tech. Past tense. Present tense isn't as interesting." She almost smiled. "What do you do now?" "Freight." She looked at the folder in his hand. The folder that she could see, now that she was closer, contained printed documents, not delivery manifests, not work orders. She caught the edge of what appeared to be a formatted financial table. "Freight," she repeated. "Overnight runs, mostly. Tonight's was canceled." He glanced at the folder and seemed to become aware of her noticing it. "I was in the neighborhood, with financial documents." He didn't answer that. Lily, who had been following this exchange with the attention of someone watching a tennis match, said, "Daddy was looking at the building from outside. He said he used to work here." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Did you?" Victoria said. 28th floor. "A long time ago." She looked at him differently now, not with warmth, not yet, but with a recalibration. She knew who had been on the 28th floor, and when. There had been a company there. She had, in fact, used one of their frameworks. Most people in her industry had, without knowing where it came from, because it had come embedded in a platform that had been acquired and absorbed, and was now so deep in the infrastructure of half a dozen analytics companies that its origins were entirely invisible. "What's tonight?" she asked. "A guess, but a specific one." He looked at her for a long moment. "Investor presentation. Third-party recap. Someone's putting together a fund using the old architecture, and they want to walk through the original methodology with backers. And you weren't invited. I wasn't told about it." The lobby had emptied somewhat. The clock behind the security desk read 4:17. Victoria had a dinner at 6 and a call at 8 and a board memo to review before midnight. She said, "The presentation is on the 31st floor." Something shifted in his face. Not surprised he had known, she thought. That was why he had been standing outside. Not deciding whether to come in. Deciding whether to go up. "I know," he said. "Do you want to?" He looked at Lily. "There's a coffee station on 31, Victoria said, to Lily. "They have hot chocolate." Lily looked at her father. He looked at the ceiling. He looked back at Victoria. "I'll regret it either way," he said. "That's generally how it works," she agreed. The room was full when they arrived. It was one of the smaller conference rooms on 31, the one Victoria had once used for board prep sessions, with a whiteboard wall on the south side, and the sort of view that made investors feel that the money was already working. There were 14 people in the room. A man named Grant Ashby was presenting mid-40s, good at presentation, the kind of man who wore confidence as deliberately as he wore his suit. Victoria had met him twice. She did not trust him. She had not planned to walk in. She had meant to drop Daniel at the elevator and continue to the garage. But the elevator had opened on 31, and she had stepped off with him, and now they were standing in the doorway, and Grant Ashby had paused his slide. "Victoria," he said, recovering smoothly, "I didn't know you were joining us. I'm not, she said. I'm just walking through. She was watching the room. She recognized 3 of the investors, Clearwater Capital people, conservative, the kind of fund that wanted methodology airtight before they committed. She watched them look at Daniel. She watched Daniel look at the slide. He had gone very still, the kind of still that was not hesitation, the kind that was recognition. The slide was a diagram, a framework, displayed in the clean visual language that consultants used when they wanted something to look like it had always existed. Victoria knew this framework the way she knew her own work. She had studied it during the years when she was building Hale's analytics architecture. She had cited it, internally, for her own reference. She had never cited it publicly because by the time she used it, it had no visible origin. It had come to her already embedded in a platform, already stripped of the name behind it, already laundered through 2 acquisitions, and a rebranding into something that looked like industry standard, rather than individual creation. She had assumed, genuinely assumed, that the original creator was either dead or had exited the industry so completely that the question of origin had become academic. She looked at Daniel Holt standing in the doorway, looking at his own framework on someone else's slide. Grant Ashby was smiling at Daniel. It was the smile of a man who had already done the math on this situation and found it resolved in his favor. "Can I help you?" he said. The question was pointed at Daniel. "I don't think so," Daniel said. "This is a private investor meeting." "I can see that." One of the investors, a woman near the window, Eleanor Marsh, whom Victoria knew, slightly leaned forward. "Is this related to your presentation, Grant?" "Not at all." Grant turned back to the room. "As I was saying, the architecture here has been independently verified, and the intellectual property chain is clean." "Is it?" Daniel said. The room was quiet. Grant turned back to him. His smile was gone. "I'm sorry?" "Slide 9, Daniel said. "The weighting model in the bottom left quadrant. The variable isolation schema. You have it inverted." "A pause. The Caldwell adjustment," Daniel said. "On page 7 of whatever underlying document you pulled this from. If you pull it without the Caldwell adjustment, it runs correctly for flat market conditions and inverts under volatility above threshold. It's not immediately visible. You have to know to look for it." Grant Ashby looked at him. "Who are you?" he said. Daniel picked up his daughter, who had been holding his hand and watching the room with wide, careful eyes. "My name is on the framework," he said. Slide 2. Nobody in the room moved. Grant Ashby stood at the front of the room, the way a man stood when the floor had just become uncertain beneath him, but he had not yet permitted himself to acknowledge it. The slide behind him, Daniel's diagram, reskinned in the corporate palette of whatever design firm Grant had hired, was still on the screen. The room contained 14 people, and a silence that was doing significant work. Victoria watched Grant's face go through a sequence of expressions she read as disbelief, calculation, anger, recalculation. He was not stupid. He was understanding, in real time, exactly what was happening. He looked at Daniel. He looked at Lily, who was standing at her father's side holding his hand, and watching the room with the stillness of a child who had learned, very young, to read when a situation required staying quiet. Then he looked at Victoria. She gave him nothing. The original developer of this framework sold the IP as part of a full asset transfer in 2021, Grant said. His voice had found its floor again. Controlled, smooth, lawyer-coached. All intellectual property rights passed with that transfer. The methodology did, Daniel said. The attribution was contractually separate. Paragraph 14 of the asset agreement specifies attribution rights are retained by the originating party for academic and investment context uses. He set Lily down and opened his folder. He drew out a document and placed it on the table near the door, with the deliberate, unhurried motion of a man who had carried it a long time and was finally setting it down somewhere it belonged. "I have the agreement here if anyone would like to review it." Eleanor Marsh was already writing something on her notepad. One of the other investors, a younger man, serious-looking, wire-rimmed glasses, leaned toward the man beside him and said something too low to hear. The man beside him looked at Daniel, then at the slide, then back at Daniel. One person in the room pulled out a phone. "This is not the time or place," Grant started. You're presenting my methodology to investors and misrepresenting the architecture, Daniel said. Calm, entirely calm. Not the calm of someone suppressing something, the calm of someone who had already done the difficult internal work long ago, and arrived at this moment having carried nothing that needed to be discharged. I understand the IP transfer. I'm not disputing the IP transfer. I'm saying your inversion of the weighting model will cause this fund to underperform under the exact conditions your backers are most exposed to, and that if you present it to this room as verified and architecturally sound, you'll be doing so incorrectly. He was not angry. That was the thing Victoria couldn't stop watching. He was not performing anything. He was not making a scene. He was standing in a doorway in a coat that had lost its shape at the shoulders, holding a paper folder with soft corners from the snow, and he was the most composed person in the room. Grant Ashby had a $6,000 suit and a team of 3 behind him. It did not matter. If you're being shown this framework as the basis for a fund structure, Daniel said, looking at the investors now, not at Grant, at the people Grant had been trying to convince you, should know it requires the Caldwell adjustment to be accurate under volatile conditions. That adjustment was never part of the IP transfer documentation because it was developed 6 months after the sale. It's publicly available. It's in a white paper I published in 2022 under a Creative Commons license. It takes 11 minutes to implement. Without it, you're running a model that was accurate in 2020 and is approximately 60% reliable now. Silence. 60%, the young man with the glasses said. He had stopped leaning toward his colleague. He was looking at Daniel directly. In the relevant volatility band? Yes. Below the threshold it runs fine. Above it, the inversion compounds. You wouldn't catch it in a standard backtest if you're only running flat market scenarios, which is why it passed whatever verification process was used. He paused. He was not gloating. He was simply accounting for how they had gotten here. The gap isn't visible unless you know to look for it. Grant said something. Victoria didn't hear it because she was looking at Eleanor Marsh, who had put down her pen entirely, and was looking at Daniel with the expression of someone who had just recalibrated a significant number of prior assumptions. Lily tugged at Daniel's coat. He looked down. "Can I get hot chocolate now?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment, and in that moment, just for a second, the composure cracked slightly. Not into distress, into something softer. He put his hand on her head. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go get that." He picked up his folder. He looked at Victoria. "Thank you," he said. "For the lobby." He turned toward the elevator. "Wait," Eleanor Marsh said. He stopped. He didn't turn back immediately. He turned slowly, the way people turned when they were deciding how much they wanted to give. Eleanor Marsh was standing now. She was a woman in her late 50s, with the bearing of someone who had seen every variant of room theater and was not impressed by any of it. She had managed a fund through 3 downturns. Victoria knew her reputation. The white paper, Eleanor said. The 2022 one. Did you build the adjustment for fixed income applications, or is it applicable across asset classes? Both, Daniel said. The core logic is asset class agnostic. You'd need to modify the threshold variables for fixed income. The volatility bands are narrower, but the structural logic is the same, and you're certain about 60%. In the specific band, with the specific structure on that slide, yes. I ran the original model through 6 market scenarios during the 2022 white paper development. I can send you the underlying data if you'd like to verify it yourself. I would like that, she said. Grant Ashby had gone very quiet. The fund presentation was, Victoria recognized, effectively over. Mr. Holt, Eleanor said. What are you doing now, professionally? Daniel looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face that was difficult to name. Not evasion, not humility. Something more like a man who had made peace with an answer that used to embarrass him and had discovered, somewhere along the way, that peace was actually easier. Freight, he said. Eleanor did not react. She drew a card from her jacket pocket and set it on the table. I'd like to have a conversation, she said. When you have time, he looked at the card. He picked it up. He nodded. Lily was watching Eleanor with great seriousness. Are you a boss? She asked. I am, Eleanor said. My dad is a really good thinker, Lily said. He can explain almost everything. Except why hot chocolate costs $4. He can't explain that. Supply and demand, Eleanor said gravely. That's what he says, Lily said. It doesn't feel like the whole answer. Eleanor Marsh, for the first time in the interaction, smiled. Victoria had not moved from her position near the door. She was aware that she had been standing in this doorway for 14 minutes, which was the exact length of time that meeting had run over, and she was aware that she was looking at Daniel Holt the way she had looked at the building from her window, trying to map the distance between a thing's apparent surface and its actual depth. He was looking back at her. You're going to walk to the garage now, he said. It was not quite a question. I was going to. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the card in his hand. He looked at Victoria. The Caldwell adjustment, she said. I used the original framework. I didn't know about the adjustment. Something passed across his face. It was a small thing. A slight shifting of attention. A refinement. Like a camera coming to focus. How long ago, he said. 2021. When I was building the analytics layer for Hale's forecasting model. He was quiet for a moment. You should check your volatility projections, he said. If you're running the unadjusted model, you'll have a gap in your exposure analysis for anything above 14% volatility, she said. He looked at her. I know, she said. I found the gap last March. I couldn't trace where it came from. My team spent 6 weeks on it. Did you fix it? We patched it. We didn't know the root cause. He nodded slowly. I can show you the root cause, he said. If you want. She looked at him. Right now, she said, you have a whiteboard in here. It takes about 20 minutes. She looked at the room, which still contained Grant Ashby and his people, who were now packing up with the subdued efficiency of people, processing a significant setback. She looked at her watch. She had a dinner at 6. 20 minutes, she said. He drew it in 3 steps. Not on the main whiteboard, Grant Ashby's team had the main board covered, but on the smaller secondary board in the corner, the one Victoria usually used for quick structural sketches during working sessions. He drew with the economy of someone who had taught this many times, which she gradually understood he had. The framework went up first. 7 variables, weighted and positioned. The architecture she had studied in its transferred, stripped form. Then he drew the adjustment layer simple, at first glance almost obvious, but constructed in a way that would have required knowing exactly where the original logic was vulnerable. It was not a patch. It was a completion. She had been standing with her arms crossed. At some point in the second step, she had uncrossed them. Lily had found the coffee station, had been delivered a hot chocolate by someone on the floor who had apparently assessed the situation and concluded that this was the right thing to do, and was now sitting in a chair near the window with her feet tucked under her, reading a book she had pulled from her father's coat pocket. Victoria had watched this happen and thought, she has done this before. This is what she does when her father is working. She settles in. Here, Daniel said, circling a section of the diagram. The original transfer document included this cluster, but not the interaction with this variable under stress conditions. The interaction doesn't activate unless you hit the volatility threshold. Below the threshold, it's invisible. Your team patched it at the symptom level, which is why it works, but why you don't know why it works. She stared at the board. He was right. She had known he was probably right since the moment he opened his mouth in the doorway. But seeing it drawn, seeing the gap filled in with a logic that was so clean it looked inevitable was different. Your team didn't have the context, he said. It was not an accusation. He said it the way a surgeon might note a complication that arose from incomplete information. Matter of fact. No, she agreed. Most people wouldn't have caught even the symptom. It cost us 14 weeks of recalibration. He nodded. I know. I saw the Hale quarterly notes from last year. The performance variance in Q2 is consistent with the unpatched version. He paused. That's not criticism. It's just I recognized it. The room had emptied. Grant Ashby's team was gone. The investors were gone. The room was just them and a whiteboard. and a 7-year-old reading near a window, and the snow coming down beyond the glass in the early dark of a February afternoon. Victoria looked at the board for a long time. "You've been watching Hale's performance data," she said. "I've been watching a lot of things. From a freight warehouse. I work overnight runs. The days are long." She looked at the folder on the table. "What else is in there?" He looked at her. Then he picked up the folder and set it open on the table. There were 11 documents. She looked at them. She recognized the formatting, the particular structure of an analytical framework presented for review, the kind of document that preceded either a pitch or a publication. She recognized the methodology, too. In the same way she had recognized the whiteboard diagram as something she had encountered in fragments, absorbed and used without knowing the origin. She picked up the top document, read the first page, set it down. "You've been developing this for how long?" 2 years. "While doing freight, the nights are quiet," he said. After Lily goes to sleep, she looked at him. He was watching her with the same contained quality he had worn, since the lobby, not waiting for approval, exactly, but present. Entirely present in the way that very few people she met ever were, because most people in her world were always looking over their own shoulder at the next thing. "Why freight?" she said. He looked at Lily. "Because it has a clock," he said. "I know when it starts. I know when it finishes. I'm home." She absorbed this. "You had offers," she said. It was not a question. A man who could walk into a room and do what he had just done in that doorway, who had built the framework that her industry had absorbed without attribution, he had had offers. "I had offers," he said. "And you chose freight. I chose being home by 7. She was quiet. The snow outside the window was not stopping. It was that kind of snow patient, committed, indifferent to schedules. It would be there in the morning. "The documents," she said. "You were going to do something with them. That's what the folder was for. Not the presentation, something else." He looked at her. "I was going to send them to 3 people," he said. "I was going to do a limited review. See what came back." "Who were the 3 people?" He named 2 names she knew. The third name was Eleanor Marsh. She looked at the documents properly this time, not the first page, but through the methodology, the structure, the architecture of what he had been building in the quiet hours after a 7-year-old fell asleep. She read it the way she read things that mattered, which was to say, without performing reading, without anticipating conclusions, without the subtle editorializing she sometimes caught herself doing when she was trying to arrive at a decision she had already made. She read it clean. The work was excellent, not promising, not the kind of thing you filed as potential or early stage or worth monitoring. It was complete, rigorous, and several years ahead of what anyone in her industry was currently discussing. She knew this because she was paying close attention to what her industry was discussing, and she had been for a long time. It took her 8 minutes. She was a fast reader, and she had context that most people would not. At the end of 8 minutes, she set the documents down. "I want to be on that list," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You want to review the framework?" he said. "I want to be considered as a development partner," she said. She heard her own voice saying it, and registered, somewhere below the professional register, that she had surprised herself. She had not planned to say this. She had planned to walk to the garage 26 minutes ago. "I don't know what that means yet," he said. "I haven't defined what development partnership looks like." "Neither have I," she said. "I'm suggesting we define it." He looked at her. Then he looked out the window. Then he looked at Lily, who had finished her hot chocolate and was watching them both over the top of her book with no pretense of reading. "You don't take on projects you can't control," he said. She paused. "Excuse me?" "Your company. Every acquisition, every partnership in the public record, you structure them so that Hale retains operational authority. You don't partner. You absorb." She said nothing. "I'm not criticizing it," he said. "It's a coherent strategy. But if you're proposing a partnership, you should know that I won't structure it that way. I'm not interested in being absorbed. I haven't proposed any structure yet." "No," he said. "But I've watched how you work." She registered this, the fact of him having watched, having studied, having arrived here tonight not just with a folder but with a reading of her that was specific and accurate, and not flattering. She was not used to being read back at like this. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not dislike it. "Then what structure are you interested in?" she said. "Equal input on methodological decisions," he said. "Transparent IP attribution. A timeline I can manage around a 7-year-old schedule." He said the last part, without apology. "And I want to keep the freight job for the first 6 months while we determine whether this is actually going to work." She looked at him. "You want to keep the freight job? I've been wrong before about what this is going to work means," he said. "I'd like the option to be wrong again without losing the floor." He said this with the same quality that had characterized everything he had said in this room, plainly, without performance. He was not a man trying to impress her. He was not trying to seem humble or trying to seem significant. He was just telling her the truth of his situation. And it occurred to her, in a way that felt strangely clarifying, that she had not been in a room with someone like that in a very long time. She thought about the Caldwell adjustment. She thought about 14 weeks of her team's work spent finding a symptom they could not trace to a cause. She thought about the way he had drawn the framework on the board, not explaining it to her, exactly, but drawing it for her, trusting her to follow, which was a thing people almost never did because they either underestimated her or, paradoxically, were trying so hard to impress her that they performed complexity rather than revealing it. "Equal input," she said. "On methodology, you manage operations. IP attribution. Credited accurately, not buried in platform documentation. Timeline. I'll need to define it properly. But I can't work standard investment hours. That's not negotiable. And the 6-month buffer." "The 6-month buffer," he confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. "These are reasonable terms," she said. He looked slightly surprised. "Not much. But slightly. You expected me to push back," she said. "I expected you to counter-offer something that preserved more control." "I'm going to," she said. "But the baseline is reasonable. You can have the baseline." A small pause. "Okay," he said. Lily set down her book. "Does this mean we're staying longer?" she asked. "Because I'm actually okay with that. This chair is comfortable." She did not sleep well. This was not unusual. Victoria Sloane had never been a good sleeper, and she had learned to treat the 3 or 4 hours of genuine rest she got as sufficient. But that night was different, in that she was not running through numbers or drafting memos in her head. She was thinking about a man standing in a doorway, looking at a slide, not with admiration or not only with admiration. She was thinking about it because of what it told her about a kind of knowledge that could survive circumstances she had always assumed would eliminate it. She had a theory, one she had never articulated because it was too close to something she did not want to admit about herself, which was that excellence and stability were mutually exclusive, that the people who built things of real significance were by nature unable to build the smaller, quieter things alongside them, that the choice was binary. She had built Hale, and she had not built much else. She looked at the ceiling of her apartment and thought about Daniel Holt going home to 181st Street in wet boots to make dinner from what was in the refrigerator, and then coming up with, over 2 years of overnight freight and quiet evenings, a body of work that was the logical completion of the thing she had based her analytics architecture on. At 5:15 she got up and made coffee and sat at her desk. She pulled up the Hale forecasting model. She applied the adjustment he had described on the whiteboard. Not the patch her team had written. She unwound the patch and applied the actual correction, following the logic the way he had drawn it. It took her 40 minutes. At 6 in the morning she ran the back tests. The gap was gone. The Q2 variance that had taken her team 14 weeks to identify and 6 weeks to partially address resolved cleanly. The model ran correctly across every scenario she could throw at it, including the scenarios that had been its consistent failure states. She sat back. She looked at the window. The sky was coming up pale over the East River, and it was still snowing, faint now. The kind of snow that had been going all night, and was running out of conviction. She thought, 400 million in revenues, and the thing that had been limiting my forecasting model for 2 years was sitting in the head of a man running overnight freight. She thought, the model I based that architecture on was his, and I never knew his name. She thought, I walked past him in the lobby. I nearly kept walking, she thought, and this was the thought that stayed, the thought that sat down and made itself comfortable and refused to be filed under anything practical. I have been measuring value by the wrong instrument, not just in business. In general. As a practice, she had a gift for reading people. She had always believed this, had built a career on it, had structured her entire approach to acquisition and partnership around it, and she had almost walked past Daniel Holt without stopping because he had worn the wrong coat. She was not, as a rule, the kind of person who used the word humbling. She looked at the backtests running clean on her screen. She allowed herself to use it once, privately, before going to shower. Humbling, she showered, she dressed. She stood in front of the mirror in her apartment and looked at herself in the careful, diagnostic way she sometimes did in the mornings, not with vanity, but with the same quality of attention she brought to quarterly reviews, checking for drift. She looked the same as she had looked yesterday. She felt, inexplicably, like something had been corrected. She found his number through Eleanor Marsh, who texted it at 7:15 with a message that said, "He called me this morning. I like him. Don't absorb him." She smiled at this. She did not often smile at 7:15. She sent a text that said, "The back tests are clean, all of them." He replied 3 minutes later, "I know." She looked at this for a moment. Then she typed, "I'm going to need to renegotiate one of the terms." "Which one?" "The 6-month buffer. I want to offer 9. If it's not working after 9 months, we restructure or exit. No penalty either direction. 9 months gives us enough time to build the methodology into the platform properly and run a real test." A longer pause. "That's more generous than the original term. I'm aware." She thought about this. She thought about the 40 minutes she had spent that morning at her desk, unwinding her team's patch and applying the actual solution. She thought about how clean it had run, because it took my team 14 weeks to find a symptom you identified in 4 seconds. And I'd like to have a partnership structure that reflects the actual balance of the situation. Another pause. "Okay," he sent, 9 months. Then, "Lily wants to know if the woman from the building is going to be around more." She read this twice. She typed, "What did you tell her?" "That I didn't know yet." "That's an honest answer." Itre. She looked out the window. The snow had stopped. The city was the way it always was after a night of heavy snow, briefly, improbably quiet, the surfaces white and uniform, the usual noise of 10 million people muffled under 2 inches of fresh cover. It wouldn't last. By noon it would be slush and horns, and the regular business of the city carrying forward. She had a board call at 9. She had a structural review of the Caldwell acquisition at 11. She had, somewhere in the next week, to have a conversation with her analytics team about the basis of their forecasting model that was going to require a significant reframing of how they understood the architecture they had been working with for 3 years. She had, for the first time in longer than she could precisely measure, something she had not been expecting to have, which was a problem she didn't yet know how to solve. She found that she was not unhappy about this. She typed, "There's a good coffee place 2 blocks from your apartment building. Opens at 7. I'll be there Thursday morning if you want to start going through the framework properly." She sent it. Then she got up, made a second cup of coffee, and began her day. 3 blocks away, in an apartment on 181st Street. A 7-year-old named Lily Holt was reading at the kitchen table, while her father stood at the window, looking at the snow-covered street below. He had a cup of coffee, and the folder of documents, and the card from Eleanor Marsh, and a text on his phone that he read twice before putting the phone face down on the counter. He looked at the street. He thought about his wife, the way he did some mornings, not with the specific, acute grief of the early years, but with something softer, something that felt less like absence and more like a permanent extension of her presence into the ordinary facts of his life. She would have had a very specific opinion about last night. She would have said something that sounded like a question but was actually a verdict. She had been good at that. He thought she would have liked Victoria Sloan. Not immediately. She would have needed to think about it. But eventually, he stayed at the window for a moment longer. Then he turned back to the kitchen. "Okay, Bug," he said. What do you want for breakfast? Lily looked up. She looked at him, with the old soul face, patient. Taking stock. Reading the distance between then and now. Are things going to be different? She asked. He thought about this honestly, the way he tried to think about all her direct questions. She deserved that. She had always deserved that. Some things, he said, good different or scary different. He considered the question. Both, probably, he said. For a while, she seemed to find this acceptable. It was, he thought, one of the things he had managed to give her that he was most grateful for the capacity to sit with both at once. Eggs, she said. With the cheese on top, he opened the refrigerator. The cheddar was still there. The eggs were still there. Outside the window, the snow had stopped, and the city was waking up. And the sky above it was the pale, particular color of a morning that had not yet decided what kind of day it was going to be. He cracked the first egg. He was home by 7. That had not changed. That was the thing about foundations, the real ones, not the ones measured in quarterly reports or revenue multiples or the number of floors you occupied in a glass tower on 57th Street. The real ones were smaller. A child at a kitchen table. Cheese on eggs. A morning that started simply and asked nothing more of you than to show up for it. Everything else was built on top of that. Or it was built on nothing. He already knew which kind lasted.